to be a rock star. This is my big moment. Yeah, I think so. That would be better than a talk, right? Gracias, gracias. I think it's...
This is a presenter.
Gracias.
Next.
Uh-huh. Okay. Good. Bueno.
Okay.
Gracias.
Ahorita regresa la doctora Marisa Nazaret, que ya yo creo que unos 5 minutos.
What's that about? I think I'm going to be very loud. I think it has to be quieter. Actually, is this being recorded or is it just because I'm not sure I need all this microphone?
It's because sometimes we transmit it.
It's not being recorded, is it?
I don't think it's recorded.
No. So maybe I don't need
But it
it.
might be transmitted live.
Huh.
But we just have to find out.
I don't think the volume's on here.
No, I just want to put it. puede darlo desde aquí, no pasa nada. Sí. Gracias. Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Esta es una presentación del doctor Andrew Stirling, que viene de la Universidad de Sussex, de un centro que se llama STEPS, que es Social, Technological, Environmental Pathways to Sustainability. Ya lo dije bien. Él nos va a describir cuál ha sido su trayectoria para que entendamos un poco por qué está en estos temas de sostenibilidad, y a esta sesión fueron convocados todos los alumnos, veo muy pocos alumnos, pero se puede seguir de manera digital y se puede ver posteriormente. Gracias por haber venido.
Gracias.
Of course. Thank you. Oh, I think I've put this on. So, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today and indeed to be here. Yep. It's been a real pleasure being here the last few days. I've had some really great conversations. It's been really fun. Thank you, everybody. And it's going to be, I'm looking forward to this discussion and also to what's happening tomorrow on the course. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. I'm working hard and having a great time. And it's clear that you guys here are thinking about the issues I'm going to talk about a lot. So I'd like to make this as much of a discussion as possible. And so even if you have things that you are not clear, because thank you so much for allowing me to speak in English, and I get excited about this stuff, it's quite sad, but I do. So I may speak too fast or anything like that, please just interrupt me and we can go from there. So my name is Andy Sterling and I work at the STEP Centre. I've worked for many years at kind of interdisciplinary work around the politics of science and technology. And I've moved from physical science through to social science in the process. I also used to work for an environment and peace movement. You'll see that coming out. I can't hide it in what I will say. And you may be wondering at the outset, this is a slightly broad topic for institutes that do such great work around sustainability, social ecological systems, as you guys are doing here. But I hope by the end, even if you disagree, you'll see the reason why I want to talk in broad terms about progress and the politics of science and technology very generally in order to come to some conclusions that I think are quite politically practical about sustainability and transforming the world to be more sustainable, whatever that means. So at the beginning, I'm going to talk about some pretty big problems and some quite fundamental challenges, quite abstract. But at the end, I'm going to come to some very, I think, practical messages about methodologies that researchers like ourselves can use in our work, in the everyday life. I may be wrong on that, but at least I'm trying to, all the points I raise at the beginning, I will try to address at the end. And if you think some of the big problems I raise at the beginning are just not addressed, then let's talk about that. So that's my little advert for my talk. And you see I'm bringing in notions of emancipation, of democracy as intrinsically related, not just that I want to join them, I think these are intrinsically related to sustainability in the ways we work on it. And that basically the bottom line is what we must try to do is emancipate our ideas about progress. So let's just think about what progress is. Of course, it's different things in different places. There are differences around the world, but I'm going to try to characterize something that in this era of modernization, globalization, is increasingly common around the world. This myth of progress. And amongst social anthropologists, there may be some ethnographers here, it's, I think, a rule of thumb that if you want to get a handle on the key tensions in a society, the political tensions in the moment, then a good question to ask is about the origin myth. Because typically, whether it's class or gender or region, you will find in the origin myth a story that directly relates to the injustices and power play of the present and some of the most high points of tension in society. So if we think about our own origin myth, we have this notion of progress. In Enlightenment modernity, the notion of progress is central, whether it be evolutionary progress, This is a front cover of an Economist, which had a title inside, "You Can't Stop Progress." That emphatic force, you cannot stop progress. So therefore, do as we wish you to do. And it is remarkable, despite the many profound differences that divide the world, how similar in the current era these kinds of stories are. These kinds of phrases come out from different political systems that in other respects are really in tension with one another. That one cannot stop progress. That our hope for the future relies on progress, and especially scientific and technological progress. So there's this idea that somehow there's this singular thing. Science gives us technology, it is technology that gives us progress, and this is the case in all the different sectors we could look at, whether it be transport or materials, agriculture, the environment, the military, biology, etc. And this is not just an innocent story that is told in the background. When you see discourses in science and technology playing out, and I invite you to think about those you're familiar with in the areas you work, in the region or in different international fora, we see in it a rhetoric like this. This is from the European strategy, the Lisbon strategy, which is not just a big strategy in the European Union. It is the defining agenda for what is now a very troubled European Union project. What are we about? What is Europe about now? It's about the innovation union. We innovate. We are pro-innovation. And it is a former Prime Minister of the UK, but I think you see maybe Mexican senior politicians speak like this, that we are pro-innovation. Do you know, is that language familiar, being pro-innovation? And it's quite interesting because only in the field of science and technology is it possible in the modern world to use a language like this. What's our position on innovation? Yes, we're for it. Imagine if we spoke about health or welfare or social policy, education policy that way. So when a politician talks about their policy and then someone comes back and criticizes that policy, they say, I'm pro-policy, you're just being anti-policy. It's a totalitarian discourse. Because the point isn't whether you're pro or anti-policy, it's which policy. And yet, only in the area of science and technology do we talk about essentially the same choices, like which science and technology. We don't have that language. Around the world, in many areas, the dominant discourse is you're either for or against this one thing. And so you even get, this was a world broadcast under the BBC World Service by this president of the Royal Society of Engineering in the UK, but a few years ago, and he's a book called The Challenge of Progress. He uses a language that's very common in governance. History is a race to advance technology, the metaphor of a race. So you just go fast or slow. The role of government is to strive to stay in the race. That's a very pessimistic European view. In China, they want to win the race. Europe just wants to not fall over. But the role of the public is to give technology the status it deserves. So it's a very imperative version of this myth. And if you think I'm being a little bit selective in picking on this, of course politicians, as we all know from current politics, will say anything. But when you look at the technical language that's used to inform policymaking around the world, and I come from an institute, SPRU, Science Policy Research Institute, that does this work, and many of the key figures are colleagues in that network. The technical language used to inform innovation in areas that relate to sustainability, biotechnology, energy technologies, transport technologies, all these different infrastructures. The language used, here are technical terms with different authors. Advance, early movers, first moving, catching up, latecomers, forging ahead, falling behind, leapfrogging. You see the metaphors there. It's all about a race. As if the big questions in any given area are simply about how much we should do of the thing, the biotechnology for agriculture, or the transport system, or the energy system. How fast should we go? What's the risks? Let's implement it in as least risky a way as possible. And then worry about who's ahead and who's behind, who's winning and who's losing the race. So even the language, even before we start with analyses or questions, the actual language itself of policy in science and technology around the world is hardwired to not even provide words or vocabulary for asking questions like, in any given sector, which way, who says, and why? And crucially, what are the alternatives? What are the different directions that we could go in? Because actually, although there are academics, as we all know, love to argue and disagree, especially about words, with each other endlessly, and especially in social science, every single social science that looks at the processes of progress of science and technological change, and of course social change as well, agrees that it's more like this. It's a branching evolutionary process akin to biological evolution, where there's a possibility space and all sorts of different things can unfold. And there's a variety of different processes condition that. So for instance, to take arguably the most difficult area for me to make my case, I could say this in any sector, agriculture, transport, materials, but let's look at biotechnology, let's look at energy, and not just energy in general, but the very demanding task of achieving a zero carbon energy future, which the main issue there is a challenge. It's hugely difficult. How is the world going to achieve this very demanding target? The constraints are huge. And yet even there, when we find ourselves so constrained, apparently, yet nonetheless, there is an enormous variety of choice. If you look at all the leading global or national assessments of what the energy strategies might be, or which could be realizable to deliver zero carbon energy, although all of them are challenging, there's plenty of choice. We can use distributed or concentrated renewable energy systems, radically different. We could use grassroots innovation, where community organization is the main driver, or we could use highly centralized technical innovations. We could use renewable energies or nuclear power. We can use carbon capture and storage techniques. We can use very advanced urban concepts, or we can use more distributed systems. We can use innovations based on services and reorganizing organizations and behavior change, or high-tech stuff. Now, of course, these aren't mutually exclusive. In reality, the world is a complicated place, and many things get done at the same time. But the point is, in the end, global infrastructures, as well as regional ones, will standardize, optimize systems for particular ways of doing it, and thereby make it difficult for other things to happen. They will still happen a bit, but they will be at the margin. So although we talk about zero carbon energy as if it's one thing, we are actually making choices when that happens, which we're not speaking about, around the way electricity systems are configured, the standard setting, the technological regulations, etc. So it's not a technical business of managing this, it's a political process. And in democracies, we might hope it will be a democratic process. But it's not much chance of being democratic because we're not even speaking about it. We're just thinking zero carbon or not. And the same is even more true in other sectors. And the reason this matters is because, again, what all the different disciplines that have investigated the dynamics of science and technology and innovation more broadly, innovation including social innovations, organizational change and other things that come with it, all the disciplines that look at that agree that the dominant processes are processes of closure. So as time unfolds, the actual array of choices closes down for many reasons. So for instance, I won't go into them. Again, these are key authors who've written on these things. But think about expectations. What we expect to happen is the single most important factor in what actually happens. So there's a very strong positive feedback loop. And especially in finance markets, if finance markets can invest in a number of different technologies, but they actually think technology A will take place, they therefore are more keen to invest in technology A, so the discount rate comes down in technology A, so capital is cheaper, so it's more likely for technology A to happen. And there's a very quick positive feedback takes place, just because global capital and finance markets expect technology A finds it easier to succeed. And expectations in a general sense, the fact that the US government committed itself for reasons that were geopolitical to the astounding achievement of going to the moon in a period of 10 years made it happen in ways that are very difficult to reproduce now. But other drivers of closure take place too. In fact, arguably one of the most important is just chance, just like in biological evolution, contingency. The QWERTY keyboard is responsible, although used in different ways in different languages, is responsible for it's not the world's biggest problem, but repetitive stress injuries at work, because a keyboard is designed the opposite to be the right keyboard. The right keyboard is one which allows you to move easily your fingers between letters that tend to be used together in different languages. But in the 19th century, mechanical typewriters, if you move too quickly from key to key, then the heads of the typewriter would jam. So they had to separate letters that were used together. The opposite of what you do to make people healthily able to work. The opposite. And we still have those keyboards. We could, and we of course try to start better keyboards, as many people may know who may experiment with them, but by and large we are locked in to what we know to be bad keyboards, and no one wants that. There's no secret capitalist conspiracy in a basement meeting every year in Switzerland deciding how we keep this together. We do it ourselves, just by processes that are distributed, like evolutionary processes. So there's a series of these that are well documented. But of course, when power comes, it amplifies that. So you have the way cities modern cities are captured by the automobile rather than public transport. Again, something I think is very close to home here. It's not an innocent thing that just randomly happens. There are well-documented stories of how cities like, formatively, Los Angeles were deliberately configured by very tough interventions by the automobile industry to make the city dependent on the car and destroy public transport. And it goes on around the world now. And that's the same in all sorts of different sectors. And even in commercial consumer markets, for consumer products like the one I'm using, it's well known, and I'll probably discover it during this talk, how suboptimal those competitive consumer markets actually are. That technologies that everyone agrees to be poorer, if they get started earlier or get some sort of a head start, they end up capturing the market even though everyone agrees they're not so good because of network externalities. So there are many mechanisms, we understand them very well, that actually not all those things technologically that are scientifically realistic, technically practicable, economically feasible and socially viable will actually prove to be historically realizable. The possibility space of technology is only minutely explored by what we actually do, just like evolutionary space. And that's true even of demanding configurations for sustainable technologies. We will never develop all the things that we could do. We won't let ourselves. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Lock-in is not necessarily a bad thing. It's the way we economize. It's the way we get things done. So you don't have to think it's a bad thing to just accept it's a reality. And the problem is it becomes a bad thing when we don't speak about it, which we don't, let alone argue. So let me now move to how the knowledge production world, the academic appraisal, the sustainability assessment world links into this a bit. Because the normal process, whether it be in academic research or big global assessments or regulation of technologies, all these different areas, the main way in which society, in fact really kind of the only way in which society engages with these problems is regulatory assessment tools like risk assessment, like cost-benefit analysis, like ecosystem service valuation, life cycle assessment. There are a series of tools, and I'm going to try and capture here the essence of all those tools together in one example. Again, I picked the example that should be most difficult for me because it's the most mature and sophisticated area around the world for comparing different technological options. Normally things aren't compared. Normally we just say, hey, here's something that a powerful company wants to do. Shall we do it? Yeah, okay. And maybe we worry a bit about, yeah, okay. So this is an area where the tools have been more developed than elsewhere. Yet even here, this is the picture that applies. And I hope you may recognize this from other areas you may be familiar with. An individual study, certainly an individual expert, an individual study or a committee that's advising a government or a company or an NGO consortium will typically give a picture like this to the question, hey, what's the most risky energy technology? So you see a horizontal scale, you see the different options, if they're being compared at all, and you see numbers assigned to show how good or bad. In this case, good is on the left, bad is on the right, because it's a risk measure. The same thing applies to cost benefit or life cycle, whatever. So you appear to get a very clear picture, what's good or bad. The problem is that if you do a meta-analysis behind that of all the other studies in the same literature, peer-reviewed, and in fact these studies are all commissioned by government or industry bodies, so they come from they're peer-reviewed and they are sponsored by the same kinds of interests, you get an enormous latitude for variation. So the grey shows that one study. The numbers on the right show the numbers of study I'm reviewing, and the bars, the thick black shows the interquartile range, so 50% of the studies lie in that thick black range. The whole range lies in the long thin bar. You will have noticed, you won't notice in that, but I'll go back to the previous one. The increments are logarithmic. Each vertical bar represents a difference of 100-fold, 2 orders of magnitude, in the estimates in the peer-reviewed literature for the risks of different energy technologies. So the difference of disagreement about any one technology is typically a factor of tens of thousands of times. In other words, the optimistic answers are tens of thousands of times more optimistic than the pessimistic answers, with the same metric. Even the interquartile range, there are several orders of magnitude difference. But the most important point is that using this peer-reviewed literature, and it's even more true elsewhere in other literatures on toxicology, agriculture, etc., you can, if you like, justify any choice you like across the different options by these techniques. This is the so-called science-based, evidence-based policy. The message here is the evidence does not dictate a policy. And the fact that we say it does is another indication of this imperative for progress. There's only one way. There is no alternative. Really strongly reproduced in these literatures, because you get in big trouble. I've got in big trouble by pointing to this kind of meta. You don't get funding for it. You don't get invited to conferences when you do this kind of meta-analysis and show the. They say, yeah, sure, but please, Andy, can you aggregate? Why aggregate? It doesn't. We can talk about it more. It doesn't tell you anything. It's just, in fact, if you aggregate these, you end up the average is the existing retail price of electricity, because these guys know that if they evaluate the risks of energy in money terms too high, it'll never be a tax. It's too big. If it's too low, it makes no difference, so it'll never be a tax. If these analysts want to get a tax that optimizes the market, they need a number in that average area around the market price of electricity. So that's what they get. And it's not because anyone's being fraudulent or bad, it's because the positivistic science typically completely misrepresents how much it is framed. There's thousands of framing assumptions. I don't think I've got a slide here on that. No, many framing assumptions go into this. The baselines, the recruitment, the weightings, the conventions that are used, the value functions, a whole series of different assumptions are adopted, which end up meaning that analysts can, without any fraud or any bad practice, get whatever number is most convenient. And they do. So, let's just then look at all the mechanisms like this that operate. These kinds of techniques, what happens is in regulation or in governance of technology, a single thing that is proposed by the loudest voiced, GM crops, IP-intensive pharmaceuticals, nuclear power, is proposed. The question is simply, is this risky or not? Or how risky is it? And then you get a graph like this showing how it is in fact not so challenging. So these processes of knowledge production that we're engaged in are part of the reinforcement process. Likewise, what this means is that if you think across industry, what gets privileged then are the things that offer the particular choices that offer the best rewards to the interests most dominating their development. So in business, technical fixes are much better than social ones because you can appropriate the value of that. Control of supply chains, options of offer you control of supply chains are very attractive. Ones that don't offer you that control are not. So if you've got an agricultural product which encourages the use of another agricultural product, that will be much better than one that just sits on its own. In pharmaceuticals or many other technologies, it's no point in spending ages developing innovations that you can't claim intellectual property on. So those that do deliver intellectual property are the ones that get focused on. So in pharmaceuticals, you get those kinds of interventions. In agriculture, you also get genetic modification. Why is that so popular compared to other kinds of technology? Because it allows the appropriation of intellectual property. So there's a series of these things. I don't want to oversimplify. There's a series of these processes, but that's why we end up being entrenched so much into particular pathways rather than others. Not because they're better, Also not because they're worse. This is not, again, it needn't be seen as a criticism. It's just the way the world works. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It only becomes bad when we don't talk about it. Likewise, even when we start speaking, as is very fashionable now, especially in Europe and North America, the responsible innovation discourse. So there's all sorts of discussion. I'm quite interested in a number of responsible innovation projects that are military. There's a lot. What's that about? I mean, again, you don't have to be against the military to think it's a bit odd when during the US Air Force bombing campaign of Iraq, the bombers that were undergoing that campaign were the subject of a responsible innovation project by a university we all know, which actually asks the question, how can we improve the cockpits of these bombers so that if the pilot has to eject, they are less likely to injure themselves? It's responsible innovation, which increasingly is becoming dominant in sustainability discourses. It has no criteria or handles. I'm not saying it's necessary. You don't have to be a pacifist to see there are some unanswered questions in that characterization. And likewise, right on sustainability itself, when we hear about the sustainability transition, the idea is not of transformations in a broad sense, but of transitions, singular things, the transition, often with the word great or grand in front to emphasize how important it is. It's a single thing, and we have models and missions and handbooks and manuals and roadmaps. Yeah, have you seen roadmaps for these sustainability things? It's really interesting. I invite you, next time you see a roadmap, especially one on sustainability, have a look at it. It'll only have one road on it. Who needs a roadmap when there's only one road? That convention, which is ubiquitous in the world now, captures what I'm trying to say. The language of the map and let's think about everything is there, but when you actually look at it, there's only one road to the technology that everyone is supposed to focus on, the synthetic biology or whatever it may be. And the question, this is a report from the European Union quite recently, where on the front cover, it emphasized the point I'm making earlier. I was very excited when I found this, because it tells us the questions we're allowed to ask. What cost and what speed? Those are the questions we're allowed to ask about change. Don't ask other questions about which way. So, and the Anthropocene, and increasingly after the decision a few weeks ago by the Geological Committee to recognize, or begin the process of recognizing the Anthropocene period, planetary boundaries. The language, I don't want to dismiss this, it's important, many of us may have worked on this language of planetary boundaries in the Anthropocene. But coming from some of the leading figures here, who I admire greatly, but the languages of non-negotiable control variables of the Earth, about controlling the Earth itself, not about being restrained or caring or responsible in what we as societies do. Somehow it's about controlling the Earth, maintaining optimal Holocene conditions, that humanity is a control force, and there's absolutely no uncertainty, no compromise. These are quotes from Johan Rockström, who I think is a fantastic guy, very enlightened, but this language gets used even by enlightened people. So the environmental discourse is turning into a discourse of control, again, forcing what, in this case, the language of climate change increasingly from the IPCC and the Anthropocene discourse, is this phrase here, maintaining optimal Holocene conditions. So it has been decided somehow, without a debate, that Holocene conditions, whatever they are, of the Earth itself, are optimal. Recognize that language? Same as and we have to maintain them. And the way we do that is clear, it is climate geoengineering. Even if it doesn't work, that's not the point. The point is it's about performing this optimal control strategy. So this is why it matters to sustainability, this language. We can see it very close in front of our eyes in this field. When the reality is like this, there are multiple divergent paths, there are multiple views of every path, and the dominant drivers of this are not singular controlling interests. There is no cockpit deciding these things. It's about collective agency, political struggle, and choice. And actually, if we retreat back from the new Anthropocene planetary boundaries type of language, what we see in sustainability makes this really clear. In fact, for me, the most exciting thing that happened in the global governance in last year was not the Paris outcome, although that was great on climate change, if we actually managed to do anything on it. It was the Sustainable Development Goals. And it captures this plurality. There's not just one goal. There are a series of different goals, and they're viewed very differently. And what gets scoffed at sometimes as being so many different targets and indicators, actually for me are the really crucial point about it, because it underscores how political this process is. And it's even more so when we look at where sustainability came from, because the three constituting pillars that are now elaborated in the Sustainable Development Goals about social equity, human well-being, ecological integrities, were all, I picked on particular faces, but these are absolutely the focuses of struggle over centuries by social movements. These are not political control by policy optimization. They're collective action and struggle by social movements contending over alternative directions for progress, not about trying to optimize a particular one, but trying to struggle to move the direction of progress away from its incumbent orientation. At every step, strongly resisted by exactly the elite institutions that have now taken this language of sustainability, and guess what? Are using it in this completely different way. And again, one doesn't have to be a conspiracy theorist or even critical to see that this incumbent institutions, it's difficult making decisions. You can respect how difficult it is in elite policy making to justify oneself. So you can see the pressures that lead to this. It doesn't need to be a critical analysis. It's just a fact of life that this is what happens to these kinds of discourses, and we forget the reality of where sustainability came from. And it matters because also in the Brundtland combination of these things, Grohal and Brundtland back a generation ago formulating this stuff, really emphasized, as certainly Planetary Boundaries forgets, but sometimes even the Sustainable Development Goals, the importance of democracy, of citizen participation, and democracy was central to the processes, which are now increasingly looked at in terms of metrics and outputs. And why this matters, why the political dimension matters, is very concrete. If we think, and we'll all have different ideas about exactly what the examples might be, but if we think about the key problems that constitute sustainability to this day, pesticides, issues of toxic pollution like asbestos, ionizing radiation, heavy metals, carcinogens, chlorofluorocarbons, endocrine disrupting chemicals, etc., etc., etc. Just think back in the history of any one of those, and you can see at the beginning, without exception, they were championed by social movements who were completely dismissed as being absolutely marginal, completely wrong by the incumbent institutions of government, of industry, and of academia. And only over decades were these one by one slowly accepted. And although we still have these problems, it's now not controversial to say these are in fact problems. It was controversial at the beginning. So that social movements recognize these things first. Doesn't mean they're always right, but it does mean that things get realized first, not by elite science in universities, let alone business or government, until people have been banging up the door for decades. And even the solutions are the same. Think now with the sustainability debate about, it's relatively uncontroversial. People like Trump will of course disagree with everything here, but it's within sustainability, I shouldn't have mentioned that word. Sustainable farming, renewable energy, super efficient infrastructures, closed cycle production industry. We're still struggling to work out what these mean, but it is not controversial now that these types of innovations and the organizations and practices that go with them are constitutive of sustainable development. And yet all of these were developed first in social movements, struggling against really strong exclusion by government and industry and academia. It's possible. The story of wind power is really interesting. I can't go into it, but actually we could really be, wind power now is a massively bigger industry than nuclear power. The investments in renewable energy together around the world in 2013 were more than investments in all the fossil fuel electricity production put together. I mean, it's an insufficiently acknowledged thing, what an enormous transformation is underway in the world. And yet, it is possible to conceive of a world, all the intellectual property in the wind turbine industry, including the Chinese wind turbines, which are now the dominant manufacturers, go back to a small bunch of Danish firms who grew up in agricultural equipment companies from anti-nuclear movements, getting together with colleges of agricultural training to develop very small turbines for farmers and communes in Denmark, which had the first anti-nuclear policy. And it had an anti-nuclear policy so it didn't crush this stuff. It's a tiny European country. And other countries experimented, but they all failed. USA, Sweden, Germany, UK failed in their renewable energy. So all the intellectual property went back to these, that is now extant in these big companies. So we could live in a world without wind turbines at all if Denmark hadn't survived that pressure in the 70s. So Let's then, what can we do about this? How do we actually think about our own practice, about methods? The basic point I'm trying to make is, it is still obviously important to inform policy making. I don't intend any disrespect to policymakers or business or government in what I say, but too much emphasis is spent in academia thinking we must inform policy making, and much too little about informing politics more widely, because if we're interested in transformative change, that's where it comes from. And it's quite clear what kinds of features methods need to have to do that. They don't just deliver these singular, precise justifications, because that's what power needs to justify itself. What they do is inform contention, conflict, struggle, dissent, skepticism. So they need to be broader in the inputs and more open in the outputs. So what do I mean by that? The inputs are the kinds of problems that are considered, the different framings, the different ways of looking at the problem that are completely concealed by these very aggregated answers. The options, the pros and the cons, the different perspectives, the uncertainties, all those things I showed to be missed out by the type of analysis that's so familiar in global assessments now. We should take account of those more in assessment. And the outputs are how we inform policy. So when an analyst, a researcher, comes to inform at the end of their study, they don't just say, here is the answer. They say, under these conditions, this would be the answer. And under those conditions, those assumptions or those values, that would be the answer. A plural and conditional approach. And you can do that with a lot of different methods. You don't have to choose one method. So here I just show, for the sake of illustration, a range of methods ranging from expert analysis to participatory approaches. Qualitative and quantitative are quite different. And a particular method, of course, in this space can take many different forms. There's all sorts of ways of doing something, and the devil is in the detail. But nonetheless, one can think of a method being located so that one can do a decision analysis, and we've been talking with colleagues here about decision analysis in some discussions. You can do it in the way I showed you earlier, where you pretend there's only one answer to the rankings. Or you can do it to acknowledge the uncertainties. Or best of all, you unpick the uncertainties to show how the picture varies depending on the values that are used, and explicitly show from the same evidence base how you get different answers with posing the question differently. You can do the same with participatory practice. This is not a point, participation tends to be about closure, consensus, juries to have verdicts. It's the same process. So here's a bunch of methods, and my basic point is not to try and sell a method. Although I can illustrate it with concrete method, and tomorrow we'll do a session in the master's class with one method just to illustrate concretely what this might mean. But the point is, there are huge pressures that push attention in academia and business and government to the top left. Approaches that are narrow and closed down. Cost-benefit analysis, risk assessment, stakeholder negotiation. And I'm saying that leads to that kind of vision. It leads to a global control type of sensibility, rather than a political, democratic sustainability sensibility, where we acknowledge plurality. And there are plenty of methods that help us to inform and work with the kinds of processes of transformation that we know, if you think back at all the various transformations, whatever we may think are important, away from slavery, from colonization, women's emancipation, worker emancipation, the welfare state, whatever process, and of course they're all incomplete. But if we look back at the history of those struggles and ask ourselves what really drove the transformative potential, it wasn't top-down policy informed by evidence-based academic research. That followed and was often crucial, but the driver was the things that are missed now. So my conclusions then. We are in a world at the moment where progress is regarded as a single thing. It's looked at in very narrow ways. If we do assessment at all, it comes out with a picture like this, that is given in a closed-down way to policy, where existing incumbent interests are basically not challenged and reinforce these processes of lock-in. And what I'm saying that sustainability really has an imperative for is to recognize the many possible paths in any given sector, even to achieve sustainability. There are many choices. We should broaden out the way we understand them, the issues, the values, the different pathways, the uncertainties, to give a picture like this. That should be communicated not just to policy, but to politics more generally. You should recognize these things are political. We need to have political debates about them. And in democracies, the way to settle it is in a plural and conditional way, where in the end we will make decisions and commit, but we will recognize the value of diversity. And so in the end then, these things that are seen to be in tension with each other, progress on the one hand and democracy on the other, are actually not in tension at all. There are very clear interests that wish to present it that way. But the best way of realizing a scientifically rigorous progress is also the best way of realizing a democratic kind of progress, and that involves emancipating progress in the ways I've tried to talk about. Thanks very much.
Preguntas, perdón. Todo está clarísimo después de este bombardeo de ideas.
Is there a light switch so we can see?
Porque no sé si me va a salir bien.
¿Me ves a mí?
Sí, o a ti. Ok, voy a intentar.
Puedes en español, inglés y
I'm gonna try English.
Thank you, I'm sorry to make you.
But if it's not clear, maybe you can help me. This is like a global perspective.
Yes.
And I always think that these global perspectives are like the big deal here, but the local is like more we like doing stuff, no?
Yes.
I am a student of
Yes.
this program, and when I like go into my study case,
Yes.
I figure out how I can apply all these kind of
Yes.
methodologies to
Yes.
this.
Yes,
So
it's difficult.
yeah, I know. But you have like some kind of like methodologies
Yeah.
applied to local study case, or how you like try to orientate a little more like in a local perspective?
Thanks. There is no site so local that it is not political. So in every very specific location, and I know this sounds arrogant on my part, but if I'm wrong, please explain, tell me. I've never known a case where there aren't opportunities for different understandings, radically different ones, of the problem in a village, in a particular village. The men and the women on the agricultural practice or the water practices will often look at it differently because the social structures are different. The young people, the old people, the poorer people, the richer people. And there's no place on earth where you don't find mixes like that. So this point I'm making, the politics is crucial, applies even at very specific. So the idea that it's all about scale, somehow politics is at a high scale, but it's not at the small scale, I think is just wrong. So when we use methods, the types of things I said about methods a couple of slides back, well, these sorts of things actually, where I'm saying emphasize not just giving one answer, but showing how even in this particular setting, what looks like the best agricultural strategy is not clear. I as a researcher cannot tell you the best. I can tell you that if you take the women's view, it's like this. If you take the men's view, it's like this. And that's political. And who am I as a researcher, technically, by analysis, to adjudicate politics? But I can show you the implications that may not be so clear without my analysis. So I have a vital role, and I can help. So use these types of methods in the local place. And I don't want to say, I mean, tomorrow, if there's a need for more concrete things, I'll try to explain one method so you can see in one concrete context. It's multi-criteria mapping, it's one of these. But the point isn't that, there's so many. But the point is, even in a particular local, you can use methods that give these plural understandings. And often they're even a cost-benefit analysis, you can do a sensitivity analysis and show how you can get different answers. So even that, I've criticized it, but you can use it in quite good ways. Is that addressing your... Thank you.
Hi, Andy.
Hi.
Thanks for your talk. I'm just sort of absorbing because it's like I can emotionally respond to what you're describing, but then my brain sort of gets bogged down because you describe these really dominant power structures that sort of make the story and the questions. I mean, it closes down what our pathways could potentially be. You described really just one pathway, right? What are the mechanisms then to open up to an innovation democracy? I mean, you end with that, but what then? I mean, with research, I like this because it sort of shows the range of mechanisms for research.
Yes.
But with policy, if policy pushes towards the pathway and the answer and the number, as you described at the beginning, then how can you move from that?
I think, I mean, the main, so yes, I did try to focus on these because I wanted to I am aware how critical and also abstract this can get. So I wanted to be concrete for researchers, which we are. But it's not working anymore. The wrong button. Okay, good. So in general, I would say, as Brundtland did, talk about democracy, talk about politics, talk about power. Just to talk about them is quite subversive, because there are such powerful forces at work trying to pretend these are technical, managerial issues. I pointed to them with the language. This is a management, the transition, denying choice, denying plurality. So just at every opportunity, acknowledge it is political. That alone, I mean, I found talking about power, saying power is not a bad thing, but it has consequences. And so when we speak about technology or sustainable technology, we should look at what the most powerful interests are backing and just question it. And look at what's being marginalized. Because just because it's marginalized doesn't mean it's good, but it does mean we may not notice it. So just asking these kinds of questions in 1,000 different ways, at a local level, in government, at the city level, and at national and international policy. It's the same basic thing. It's not about scale. Every scale takes place. Ask questions about politics, about power, and don't think this is a technical matter. And as a researcher then, your responsibility behind these methods is not to pretend that it's technical and somehow we can derive these single optimal solutions. But I think in general it's about just asserting democracy in the same way it always has to be, by struggle.
Hi.
Hi.
I have more or less the same question that Amy has, and I think of the opening word, progress, as not democratic. Maybe the discourses that follow from that word tend to persuade policymakers or researchers or people that are involved in making decisions to try to pursue progress, when it's actually maybe we have to change the question of what the main goal has to be, or the different goals that different people pose. So if we're trying to design some kind of policy that is broad enough to be applied for different countries, like globally, then we have to think differently, but then we have the different cultures involved, and then we have like different levels of political participation. So I think that there's more problems if we're deriving everything from the word progress. So it's like, I don't know. I don't guess I have only one question. So
thank you. I think that's a great point, and I do see what you mean. If I were saying the only thing we should do is progress, blah blah blah, it's a disaster. But I would defend, for two main reasons, this focus on progress. You're right. Often the language can be captured by forces that you cannot control. But there's another danger, and the left is especially prone to this danger of wanting to be so pure that it will not touch any word that's got any kind of traction, and therefore is self-marginalizing even before it gets marginalized. So the dance, which is a dangerous dance, is between the two. And I would say as part of the mix of emancipatory struggle, only part of it, of course, that actually the notion of progress and democracy, or of emancipatory struggle, are intrinsically linked, because progress is about the possibility of a better world. And for me, few things are more disabling of emancipatory struggle than the idea of, well, it's not really possible to have a better world. For me, that hope for a better, whatever it may mean, that hope for a better world is central to emancipatory struggle, which is at the center of sustainability as it should be seen. So for me, I don't want to give up this word. It's a fight. And there are forces. I've identified the forces that are trying to take this word and use it in a different way and seize the word back. Because rightfully, I think the word progress comes out of struggles, albeit, as you're right, I mean, the history of the word goes in different ways, but all different traditions of democratic struggle in different political cultures have the notion of a better world, that the future could be better, let's fight for it. And so what better word for that than progress? So it's not a simple thing, but that would be my tactical counter to the idea of giving it up. But I know it's got dangers, and we have to watch out for exactly what you say.
Well-being is an alternative instead of progress.
Well, well-being is a static. Yes, well-being is it's in the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are metrics to try to measure it, and we should argue about those, so it's absolutely crucial. But it's a static quality. Progress is a dynamic process. So they're different. They're words that do different jobs. They're not alternatives. You know, well-being is something towards which progress should take place. If we see well-being as happening, how do we get there? Well, it's a process. What do we call it? Why not progress?
¿Nadie más? The same figure that you were using for narrow and...
Yes.
Could you put that? Because you use that also with the social and natural sciences.
Yes.
Something similar.
Please, carry on.
This thing that you have as expert analytical, you
Yes.
said it would be like scientific,
Yes.
and the participatory more social.
Yes.
You use a very similar image for that.
When we took it, I did. It's part, because in the discussion we had earlier, we were talking about transdisciplinarity, and we were just having a discussion about work here in UNAM and work I'm doing to try and bridge these divides between quantitative, qualitative, or natural science, social science, or constructivist, realist. Big divides. So we were having this discussion, and I did make that distinction. And of course, these things do not go together. They are different dimensions. But the point here, Marissa, why I show it here, is because I'm trying to emphasize that the point I'm making about broadening out and opening up is not a criticism of just quantitative or just analytic. It's also a criticism. Participatory approaches can close down and be narrow. In fact, they most often are. Most of the popular participatory processes are consensus conferences or citizens' juries or other types of practice that assume that in order to be useful, you need to engineer your process to come out with an answer. So, and actually that's even more dangerous if we think somehow a participatory process is a more emancipatory process. Because if it actually closes down the choices that are informed to wider debate, it can actually be part of the problem. So that's why I've got the same scale, because I'm trying to make the point that this is not a partisan critique. This is not the social scientists criticizing natural science, because often social science, interpretive social science, will insist on an ethnographer, a very sort of left-wing ethnographer, very keen to push for emancipation, will tell quite often one story about the village. This is what's happening. My story. They're aggregating in just the same way a risk assessment will say, this is what's happening, this is our model. So I'm trying to emphasize that this is not a critique of particular methods. It's something that can apply across the board to natural, social, interpretive, quantitative, etc. That's why, and I try to illustrate here with examples of types of methods that exist in this space.
Could you show the students both now, the interdisciplinary in some way, the transdisciplinary
In the course?
and this one, and explain about the methods?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure I can. Because I'm in your hands. I'll do whatever you tell me. Well, a little bit. If it's not useful, but I was thinking and talking to Amy, especially about the session tomorrow, it's to be more concrete about a particular method to illustrate it. So this would make me talk more. I love talking, but it might be, yeah?
Talk more and convince them.
I'm not convincing you.
No, convince also the students.
Okay, well, we can talk about it. I'm happy to be flexible how it's handled tomorrow. But if we just do a practical exercise, there are choices to be made about how much I talk.
Yeah, but before getting to just one method, if you could give us like an overview of what's going on
Okay.
with the transdisciplinary. That's the course.
Okay.
All the courses about transdisciplinary. So about the social, the natural sciences, and a whole bunch of methods.
Yeah.
All
right.
And then go to the method.
Yeah, well, if we go to the method, we have less time to do it. But I mean, basically, I love talking, as you've noticed. So I'm in your hands.
You have 4 hours. You can do whatever you like in 4 hours.
Okay.
Organized like
Yeah. No problem.
whatever you want.
Yeah, no pressure, no problem. But thank you. And I appreciate the feedback.
You mentioned the role of the academy, like in the past, and how is the role right now? What in your experience in this very special moment of the humanity? I think. How do you think is the role of the academy in all this process?
Yeah. Well, of course, academia is a big place and lots of variety. But to answer you directly, I'd say disappointing. Because the potential is so huge.
I'm afraid about that answer.
Yeah, I'm disappointed in myself too. But the potential is so huge. But in my experience, the forces shaping academic inquiry are just so sad. What people end up being motivated by, and conditioned by, and shaped by. Incentives from disciplines for journals that have high impact factor because they use models that absolutely not only are abstract but are just plain wrong. But nonetheless, you get big rewards for using those models. And so an entire area, arguably the most important area of human life, resource allocation issues, dominated by economics, are systematically informed by models who've made being wrong a principle of quality. I don't want to be down particularly on economics. There's many, actually, nowhere is this better criticized than in other areas of economics, ecological economics, institutional economics, feminist economics. So there's plenty of discussion in economics, but the dominant neoclassical models are like that. And in every other discipline, I just get disappointed. And disciplines themselves are crucial. I owe a huge debt to the disciplines that have informed me. But it's just life is too short to spend your whole time in a discipline. Home is nice, but you don't spend your whole time at home. You go out and about. And that's what research should do. Its home is important, and you should be reflexive about your home. That's where you learn a lot of stuff. But get out there. And especially if you want to engage with real problems in the world. And the main thing that I really worry about is how it's almost like impolite to talk about power. It's really remarkable how much trouble you get into talking about power, especially in government advisory processes. And that's actually sinister, because it's not a bad thing that there are power relations between disciplines, there are power relations acting on certain interpretations rather than others. Everyone knows it. Go to the bar, people will talk about it openly. In the committee, there's an edge if you mention it. It also can be very subversive and have a good effect if you do, but there's a lot of pressure stopping you doing it. So I'm disappointed that academics don't talk about power more. I'm disappointed that they spend too much time in disciplines. I'm disappointed they get too influenced by these metrics and not enough about what really matters. But we can solve all those. We know how to solve them, right?
Thanks. So I think it would be really interesting to see sort of like in a very small toy problem, like the one you mentioned about the keyboard, and in which way you can emancipate the process of the design of the keyboard or whatever. What would it look like? And in a small problem, maybe it would be, you know, like very revealing.
Well, the STEP Center where I work has done a lot of projects of this kind, and we've learned from a lot of other projects done by other organizations, including projects you've done here. So there's plenty of examples, but you know, we've done work in Kenya with partners in Nairobi at the university, the Agricultural Sciences Research Establishment, working in villages in the highlands and the lowlands, and just where at the moment the national program is around promoting maize of very particular kinds. And we've just done using multi-criteria mapping, a method just you go and you talk to people in the highland villages, the lowland villages, the richer farmers, the poorer farmers, the men and the women, and you find out from these different groups, all with a stake in what kind of agronomic practice do these villages actually use, what do they spend their time, very precious time, invest in with great risk. And you talk to the people about their own understandings of these issues. You find actually that a whole series of different opportunities using indigenous crop varieties, not for cash crops, sorghum and other types of root crops that are used in these areas, you can actually see that when you put the spotlight, shine the spotlight more widely, you find that although the people working in the Agricultural Research Center in Nairobi have very different way of expressing themselves, if you ask them to evaluate the options that other people have looked at and have them look at them too, really quite an interesting convergence takes place, where although maize still can often look like a really good strategy, and there's particular kinds of maize that get used, so it's more detailed than I'm saying, one can see that these crops like sorghum and other crops of that kind are getting systematically just not talked about. So there's a lot of scope for agreement. The researchers are saying, well, it's a good point. Maybe we don't do any work on that. Maybe we should do some work on that. Because these guys, you know, we may disagree with them, but actually you can see that it's not worth us doing nothing. So that's an example. I've also in Britain done work on many different areas in the medical equipment area or in the risk area and energy area, where all you have to do is basically shine a light on another option. And immediately you start getting recognition that, yeah, okay, maybe this isn't the main thing is not the only thing to be done. So we did a project on organ transplants, what you do about kidney failure. And everyone in the UK at that stage was talking about high-profile surgery and different types of techniques, or xenotransplantation, taking organs from pigs, because you can't have anything more technologically intensive than genetically modified pigs. You take the organs out, you put them in people. Very technologically intensive. A lot of money can be made by pharmaceutical companies doing that. Hugely IP intensive. And that was what we got commissioned to do the project on. And we said at the beginning we want to look at everything, they said don't, but then we did anyway. And then when we did, we found that everyone agreed. They all disagreed about various things, but everyone agreed that the xenotransplantation option that the project was supposed to be about, everyone pretty much agreed it was the worst thing. And this is what the Research Council wanted to look at, because they were under so much pressure from big business to look at this thing. So we did look at it, but we looked at it comparatively, and we found, you know, you could make all sorts of conclusions, but one conclusion was, sorry guys, but no one agrees your option is the best. In fact, it's nowhere near the top. Before we invest in this, we should invest in about 12 other things. So that's an example of, by illuminating diversity, it sounds like it's disabling because, like, oh, how much diversity can we handle? But that's an example of how it can actually show that the dominant thing is really a bit of not a good option.
¿Alguien más levantó la mano por acá?
We had a discussion a couple of days ago in another place about the extended community peer review.
Yes.
So I realized I didn't understand how does that work. So I wonder if you have any ideas on how does the extended community peer review should work under this framework.
Great, thanks. So that's a whole body of thinking. Thank you for raising that. The post-normal science, Jerry Rabbit, Sylvia Funtowitz, there's a whole body of thinking, which I definitely am in that tradition and learned a lot from those guys, going back to the late 70s, I think, their first work on that. So extended peer review is about just a more transdisciplinary way of understanding scientific practice, that you include in peer review other actors who are not necessarily in academic disciplines. You still have the academic disciplines, but you also look at quality in a broader terms. And it absolutely fits in here. In fact, post-normal science is on some of these diagrams that I show, because it has all sorts of tools. There's websites for it. And in fact, there are websites for all these things. And if you're interested, I've done a working paper for the Nexus Network where we point to a lot of websites, which are like platforms for looking at all these kinds of methods. There's hundreds of them. I had a list in the working paper that went into this of well over 100 methods that can be used. And so post-normal science is a really neat collection, and extended peer review is one of their tools. I don't know if that, I mean, you probably know that already, so I haven't helped much.
But I was wondering if you have an example, because I have read that in text, but then I wonder, how does that work? How in real life, in a case study, how would that work? Yeah.
Well, I have to be honest, you've asked me about a very specific method, which I respect, but I haven't ever used it. And partly I should say, I don't think in my experience that the literature on extended peer review attends sufficiently closely to the power relations in review. A little bit like participation. If you don't attend to the power relations in participation, you can do a typical World Bank style participation, which is very instrumental. So just extending peer review, just by saying on your report, oh, we extended peer review, it doesn't. So to me then the important thing is how it's done. And I know that people in the Copernicus Institute and Rabbits and Fundowitz mean you really respect these other voices. But I've been on European Commission committees that have looked at projects that talk about this, and we use a language on these committees which doesn't really, it talks about, it's tokenistic, you know, so it's just about encouraging people to do a polite etiquette, encouraging people to extended peer review, just name some NGOs. And then we tick that box. So I'm telling you I know how not to do it, but I guess I'm saying it's not enough to extend peer review. You have to actually show how you're giving a voice to these marginalized interests in peer review, not just including them. So in terms of how to do it, I haven't got an example, I'm afraid, but I would say whatever example it is, don't just say it was extended, look at these people, show how those particular voices were represented. And methods like the ones I show actually, for taking different views and allowing them to interrogate the evidence and then show how their vision is different from another vision with the same evidence, that is a kind of extended peer review. And so some of these methods, if they were used in extended peer review, could make it stronger, I think. Sorry not to be able to give you an example. There's more than 100 methods, so if I claimed to have used them, I'd be not very plausible.
No, I think it's really hard, because sometimes extended peer review, it's conceived as you said, a checkbox. Yeah. So I wanted to know how the consequences of and the power and a community might get to, I mean, how outside academia can another members of the community have power to talk about it, and these may have consequences. Yes.
Well, that's why I think this opening up thing, it's more important than extending peer review. I mean, in a way you could say extending peer review is like broadening out the inputs that I tried to mention. You know, I was talking about broadening out inputs and opening up outputs. So extended peer review has a lot to say about broadening out inputs, the number of voices who get included in looking at the research and assessing its quality and making suggestions about how to improve it. So it's really important, part of this mix. But also, what about the outputs? If you've just reviewed it and given difficulties, you've not actually had an opportunity to contribute to the outputs the research gives. So for me, that's why I like this broadening out, opening up, because in the end it's not enough to just review more broadly. You have to really deliberately counterbalance the emphasis that's placed on the main interest in research. In order to be neutral, you have to deliberately counterbalance and give more resources to the marginal voices, not just extend peer review at the inputs, but also when you present the results. And here I would say that a lot of post-normal science I've seen that uses extended peer review still ends up communication to policy. In the Netherlands, there's a lot of this work gets done, which says, we've now got a really good process because we had extended peer review, and here's our answer. And the extended peer review doesn't help with the problem of giving one answer. It almost looks like another badge you put on, extended peer review, extra quality, like a soap powder. And so it's an extended peer review that also informs the way results are presented is what matters, I think.
La última pregunta, ya nos vamos, ¿no?
Thank you. These are great points. Thank you.
But then what happens with systematizing and comparing your results if you have open output that you obtain through different methods and the processes are very, very different? How do you manage that?
Well, I tried to say, I've got some other slides, but I won't try and show them. But this is not an advocacy of anything goes. This is not saying, basically it's complicated, so any answer you like is fine. Even though, as I showed in the graph, you can in fact, it's not my making this problem, if you look at the risk assessments in the world of energy technologies, you do get any answer you like. So that's not a problem of my prescription, that's actually how things are. But I'm saying, actually, when we're concerned about sustainability and we're interested in more progressive options, there will be plenty of things we just don't do. It's just that the things that we should do are plural. So the way this model tries to explain it is not, the point isn't just plural, it's plural and conditional. The phrase I used defining it here, there. Plural and conditional. So for a scientist, a researcher, not just to say, hey, here's an answer, here's an answer, here's an answer. Say, here's the answer you get from these values. And here's the answer you get from these values, or framing assumptions. And here's the answer you get from these. So it's plural and conditional. You give the different conditions attached to each, which then doesn't just inform, hey, there's choice, oh dear, what do we do? It informs, this is the political implications of this choice. This is the choice that favors the incumbent industry with its jobs and so on. Here's the choice that favors the marginalized people who may be economically not so important, but may be actually in greater need of support. So politically, it's a decision, and it's a matter for democracy what to decide. And when if the decision is made for this, it's at least transparent that this wasn't the only pro-innovation solution. This was a solution that favored incumbent interests. And so there's an accountability because of the conditions that are also conveyed. So that's the kind of crucial part, not just plurality, and it doesn't mean anything goes. There's still plenty of things, as I tried to show when you do this sort of analysis, you find quite often not only many things are not viable, but often the thing that was most strongly argued for is not viable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a very interesting talk, and also to open the discussion so nicely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.